we have today the great honor and to me an absolute pleasure to introduce you Professor Thomas Tieku from King's University College at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, where he is a professor of politics and international relations, while at the same time also working as a consultant for various international organizations and national governments. In his work and his research, Thomas focuses on international organizations, negotiation and mediation processes, the informal international practices in politics, and in particular, African politics. On these subjects, he has published widely and won awards for some. Likewise, his research and teaching have received awards, and in particular, I want to highlight the Informal International Relations Lab that Thomas established and is leading, which brings together both the teaching and the research involving undergraduate students in a research team that explores the nature and impacts of informality, that is the rules, the unofficial rules, practices, norms, and decision-making bodies in international politics. So in these ways, researching, publishing, teaching, and through an extensive and continuous engagement with scholars around the world, Professor Tieku has been one of the leading intellectual influences when it comes to studying particularly the agency and the internal modes of operation of African regional international organizations, the specific actors and practices at work in them, and the ways in which they position themselves in international and global politics. So in this way, he has slowly but surely helped moving these organizations and African politics into more general theoretical debates of international relations, where they've been conspicuously absent for a long time. And as we are all, I mean, probably most of us at least, acutely aware, still require much more serious and in-depth consideration despite all the advances made. So therefore, in today's GlobeLecture, Professor Tieku is once more picking up these strands of research and reflects on efforts by the African Union to mainstream African voices in global governance, on the one hand, and on the other, how we as researchers can best approach these efforts from a theoretical perspective. So without taking any more time, I give the floor to you, Thomas, and look forward to a thought-provoking lecture and our subsequent discussions.
Thank you so much, Jens, for that introduction. Sometimes when you get introductions like this, the only place you can go is down. When he asked me to speak here, I was thinking about the topic that I can speak, whether I should talk about informality, which I've been working on. But then I thought about the context in which we find ourselves, so which global power, there's a global power configuration, and the policy of international system is changing. And that countries that were traditionally the mainstream or close to the mainstream are now likely going to operate from the margins or semi-margins. So I thought that, German speaking to a German audience, it might be helpful for me to talk about how historically marginalized actors within international systems manage to mainstream their views in global governance, even though they are operating historically from the margins. And therefore, for a Western audience, this is something that Canada, we're also thinking about it, because traditionally, Canada has always been either at the center or close to the center. And now that the US is behaving the way it is behaving, Canada finds itself on the margins and trying to kind of an outsider looking in. So thinking about how those actors operating from the margins manage to still mainstream the idea is very important. So I thought that there would be lessons that we can learn from the African cases and from the African. So that's the context within which I put this particular topic there. So I'm going to be talking about how you mainstream African voices or the African views within global governance, and how the African Union in particular has been able to do that despite its limitations. And AU has a lot of limitations. But if there's one thing that is done really well, it's ability to mainstream Africa's view within the international system. This is the way I'm going to go about it. So I'll still begin by just teasing out in a very short way, defining the African views, and I know that as academics, we can spend all the time talking about definitions, and I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to pass, at least get you a sense of where I'm thinking about define African view, because we are talking about complex continents. So to talk about views or voices in kind of in a very singular way is very challenging within the spaces. So I want to be. Then I'm going to spend the time to talk to you. So having established the fact that African views are not on the margins of global politics, which may be a controversial statement, and therefore I need to defend it. Right? To say that, to stand somewhere to say that Africa being historical on the margin, somehow its views on international global governance, the mainstream, is something that is very controversial. I need to give you some indicators as to why I think Africa's views are in the mainstream but not on the margins. And then I'll spend some time to explain how the African Union has been able to do it despite the marginal spaces and despite its material weaknesses. Right? So that's what I'm going to spend the time. And then I'll spend the last few to talk about the implications. For policy, those of you, I wrote the lecture in a very generic way because to make sure that I'm speaking to are not necessarily only a specialist in. So for those of you who are special on Africa, if you find the lecture to be too general, you can go into the specifics, but I'm happy to go into, but I wanted to speak to much more broader audience than they have, because sometimes we tend to talk to each other, right? We don't talk across purpose. So I'm so glad that I have an interdisciplinary. So if you fall asleep in the middle of my presentation, remember this. The central argument I'm going to be making is that I'm going to make the counter-intuitive argument that contrary to popular narratives and perception, often, shaped and moved by journalistic narrative and sometimes political speech, Africa views, particularly on global governance, are in the mainstream. They are at the heart of global governance. And so that's the broader point. I know that by just talking about African views, I risk homogenizing an extremely dynamic, an extremely complex, and extremely diverse continent. So I want to make sure that and we know the dynamic nature of the continent, the diversity of the continent, and sometimes, contrary to popular perception, it is also a very globalized space. And the Duke anthropologist Charles Poet tells us that Africa is remotely global, right? In terms of, because you can find globality in different spaces of Africa, including villages. And Charles Poet's book is written using, by traveling through Togo in the rural areas. And then from that observation, he's able to make the argument that if you go to the continent, it is so global. And we can talk about it in so many different ways. For those of you who are not African specialists, the 6 most important animals that are the staple food of Africa don't have an African origin, right? We took sheep, goat, and chicken, all of them, they have an Asian origin. So talk about an African food, right? So talk about, so that's to tell you that it's a continent that is embedded in different part of it. So I know that, but to make sure that to avoid this overgeneralization and homogenizing, essentializing perspectives, I'm going to use the African, that's why I use the African Union as a shortcut to talking about African views. The AU does not in any way represent the entirety of the diversity of African views, but it is the institution that has been mandated by African Union, African leaders and African actors to speak on behalf of the continent, to articulate these African views and to mainstream African views in global governance. So I'm going to just talk about it. I'm not going to go into details about what the AU is and what the AU is not, except to tease out that if you want to understand the African Union in terms of its global representation, there are 4 articles out of the 14 of its objective that focuses on developing African worldview and then articulating it and then representing Africa in global spaces. So so you don't need everything. And I put this also over here because if you pick almost 80% of journalistic writing on the African Union, over 60% of books written on the African Union, most of you will tell you that African Union was created in 2002. That is factually incorrect. It was created in May 2021, but it was politically inaugurated in Durban, South Africa. And given South Africa's power, discussing power on the African continent, its mandate succeeded in making it seem like AU was created and it fit the South African or the popular narrative. So that's why I think sometimes the mistake academics too, we pick that particular data and we're peddling that around, but that's not accurate. So that's why I just put that small correction there. The next one, so how did the AU, what are the indicators of how the AU has mainstream? I'm just going to talk about 4 of them. The first one, if you look at it over the last 2 decades, AU has placed more than 60% of African security issues on the agenda of the UN Security Council. In other words, if you look at all the issues that are discussed within the Security Council, 60% of them in the last 2 decades have been about Africa. You can make the argument that, maybe Africa is talked about a lot within the UN Security Council because a lot of insecurities there. That's granted. But if you manage to get your view, your conflict on the agenda of the Security Council, it tells you that you're doing something. It tells you that you have agenda power setting presence. And one of the complaints, if you go to New York, has been the fact that conflict in Latin America, Asia in particular, another part of it don't get on the attention because it is crowded out by African conflicts, right? Because of that. So having it on the agenda has been. The second thing is that if at the moment the way security is talked about and discussed, particularly the practice of international peacekeeping operations, has changed fundamentally in the last 20 years, in large part because of the way the AU practice peacekeeping operations and the way AU discursively discredited traditional peacekeeping operations. So countries like Canada that have traditionally were at the forefront of peacekeeping at the moment are on the margins because the peacekeeping that is now practiced is fundamentally different from the peacekeeping that was conceptualized in the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, and 80s, in large part because of the way the African Union discursively and then as well as practically operationalized peace operation, to the extent that the word peacekeeping operation is becoming a dying breed, replaced by the language peace support operation because it's combat heavy and the rules of engagement are fundamentally different from that. And this is a result of coming from Africa. The second thing is that in terms of claiming a space for just dialogue. So the third, that in the UN Security Council, and even within the UN itself, the African Union or Africa is the one that has carved out a bigger space. So to the extent that almost every talk of a UN's relationship with regional organizations is defined by the relationship with the African Union. And only African Union has the mandate, or only African Union Peace and Security Council has regular annual consultation with the UN Security Council, annually since 2007, every year. 1 year they meet in Addis, the following year they meet in New York. No other, not European Union, not ASEAN, not any other organization. So you can see how much space African issues will occupy. And then the last point that I will make is that if you the last 20 years and 10 years of advocacy, in 2023, UN came out with a resolution 2719 for the first time, allowing UN Security Council's access contribution to support AU mandated peace operation. This is a fundamental change in terms of the practice of peace, the use of peacekeeping money. and set a standard, but that's an exception that is granted to Africa. That is not granted to anyone else in terms of, and it took 10 years, but now successfully AU has been able to do that. And this, to some extent, is going to be a game changer in terms of the way peacekeeping is operating. My sense is that down the road, Europe too, or Asia and others can also claim. If we have given that exception to Africa, at some point you should also give the same exception to us. And that's a huge thing. So, and it's not the UN peacekeeping operations. AU mandated peacekeeping operation, UN access contribution will be used to pay for it. So that's it in terms of, let's come to the last 10 years and look at the same thing in terms of global agenda. Just put, if you look at it, if you look at this diagram here, 60% of all field missions by the UN is on the African continent. 65% of agenda issues in the last 10 years is on Africa. 70% country-specific meetings, Sudan, South Africa, Lesotho, and those. 70%, if the UN is talking about any African countries, usual chances are that it's talking about Africa. And then if you look at it, 70% of all peacekeeping operations have been on the African continent. How can you claim to be on the margins when you are dominating kind of discussion in New York and other spaces? So that's the point that I wanted to make. And how did Africa manage to do that? That's the argument that I wanted to make. And then just currently, I just asked my research assistant to pull up and then look at the major global universal international organization, look at the leadership, the top leadership. Most Africans tend to complain that, the formal forums are dominated by, where's dominated by? But look at the statistics. Almost 28% of the top leadership of most of the international organizations are Africans. And most say AU endorsed candidates. The World Health Organization, the one that we know that's very, and then the World Trade Organization, International Olympic Committee. If you go at the top, the region that comes closest is Asia, 22%, Europe next 22%, and then the rest are just only tiny, even single digits, right, in terms of global representation. So Africa is really heavily represented. So contrary to sometimes the complaint by politicians, if you look at the statistics, Africa is actually in the mainstream in terms of thinking about it. Okay. So those are the indicators. We can go back. So the question then becomes, how was AU able to do this? What are the mechanisms? And that's what I'm interested in for those who are thinking about if you're advising the government and you want to draw lessons from it. So what are the mechanisms that the AU use? It's not sequential order, but I put it first and second just for the sake of remembering. My brain is so small, so sometimes just doing things, allows me to be able to remember them at that name. So the first step, often that the AU is able to do, is to set these common African positions on a whole host of issues, ranging from international security all the way to kind. So if you look at it, so there's a common African defense policy, all the way up to post-COVID-19 recovery kind of strategy, and in terms of reforming global health. And as I'm talking now, the one that is going through the system is AU position on artificial intelligence. And my understanding is that it will likely be adopted at the next summit. So if you're looking for AU positions, it articulates Africa's position and say, this is the African position. If you want to talk to Africa, this is where we stand. And it's good for reference point for global policy debate, right? So in most cases, AU will not be at the room, but in most cases, AU would often, or Africa will not be in the room, but sometimes when these policy debates are taking place, Africa will be in the room because its position is well known. It can go either way, but I think the most important thing is that AU is able to articulate these African common positions. It's not easy to agree on it. It takes a long time, but it allows it for everyone to know that this is where Africa stands. And that has been very important in terms of that reflecting in the debates by global actors. UN is able to do that because UN doesn't have to struggle. If they are looking for African position, what does AU says? And then they just sometimes, copy it and becomes the African position. And when the Africans come to New York, if you disagree, they say, oh, this is what the AU said. So you can disagree with it. So sometimes some of our government complain. So, but then this is what you agreed to in Addis Ababa. So we've taken that particular position. The second thing that has been very important in terms of AU's ability to influence has to do with the developing certain normative standard on a whole host of issues. I'm sure that a number of us, we tend to complain about AU producing so many documents that we know that a lot of them will not be implemented. Some of them are not supposed to be implemented. But what it does is that you set this blueprint to end up influencing the blueprint of other actors within the international system. What this does is that it becomes a very important advocacy document. So blueprint. And the one that is most famous, that's widely known, is Agenda 2063, which has this huge aspirational kind of, I think that we know very well that the sort of things that they are talking about is not going to be achieved anytime soon. And I put the first one is the one that I like a continent where it's difficult for you to even get a train in major cities. They are talking about integrated, not just any train, but high-speed train system across the African continent. That's how ambitious they want to be. It is. So, but it's for aspiration. It's good for aspirational politics. And it's good. It serves its purpose. And for you, that's why I always tell people, don't judge AU just by the document they produce. In some cases, informally, they know that it's not going to happen anytime soon. But it serves very useful purposes for advocacy and integration into the document. I'll give you one specific example. In the past, this would never have happened. If you look at the recently released Canada's Africa strategy, for the first time, at the pillar of it is that Canada's development assistance, its aid, is now going to be informed by Agenda 2063. And I think 2 weeks ago, the German government just signed an MOU with the African Union saying that Germany is also going to do the same thing, right? So the Agenda 2063 is now informing how aid is now going to be distributed, and it filtered itself into it. So I remember part of the reason I know the Canadian one because as an academic, I was involved in a little bit. Anytime you go to the room, the politicians, Agenda 2063. And it becomes like, a badge of honor that they know Agenda 2063. The Prime Minister is aware of it. The cabinet ministers are aware of it. So anytime you go to the room, they stand up, they want to say that they know something about Agenda 20. So I wasn't surprised the outcome document said that they have two foreign, this is the foreign policy of Canada is feminist foreign policy. Now they've attached Agenda 2063 to it as the main instrument through which they are going to use to display. So it's not so these documents are not just only for performative purposes, it has as part of it, but they also influence kind of discourse elsewhere. The third one is that AU is also often able and has been very good in building strategic relationship at the informal level. Most of it work is done through informal channels, right? Informal channel act as a great equalizer. And whether it is institutionally dense or institutionally shallow, informality is set at the heart of it. And I'm not surprised that they are getting so much joy from operating within an informal level. And actually, some of the studies that we are doing shows that the more bureaucratic the institutions are, the more you need informality to get over some of the institutional gridlocks. So the AU, it has set up this informal high-level dialogue across the world. So they have AU, UN, high-level dialogue at the strategic level, political level, at the operational level, and sometimes just desk to desk, right? Almost that channel of communication. You have the AU-EU dialogue, sometimes formal, kind of a quasi-informal, I call it hybrid informality, where you operate there, it's kind of, and then you have the AU-China or the FOCA, the Forum for Africa, Forum for China, Africa Cooperation. And then you have AU-Japan, called TICA, Tokyo International Conference on Africa's Development. And then so it has all this, I didn't put Canada there, but also Canada also has a high-level dialogue between AU and Canada. Every year, they do it in November, of which the chairperson of the African Union will be there, and Canadian prime ministers don't miss it. And it's a very, if you go there, it's a very interesting kind of dialogue. And AU has used it in a very effective way to socialize international actors into AU positions most of the time. So as I wanted to highlight. And then the last one, finally, is that the EU has used it coordinating and convening power to come out with a single slate of candidates. The reason why Africans have been successful is because AU would often mount a single slate. And once AU endorses you as a candidate, you often take on a front runner seat, not because of the numerical strength, 54 African countries, you have that constituency, and they tend to vote en bloc. And because countries are also aware that AU is like a great African country are going to vote en bloc, they do the trading. Okay, I will support you this year. Next time, I want Africa also to support my candidate. And Canada, we've realized it in a very painful way. All the time, we don't build that Africa coalition. So we have a wonderful candidate for UN Security Council. By the time they get there, European other Norway or Portugal has managed to get the African group. And despite Canada's best effort and everything that it does, and the Canadian candidate will end up losing. That's part of the reason why they set up the AU Canada High Level Dialogue, by the way, to make sure that the next Security Council that Canada is contesting, it will not win. Because if you get the AU on the side, your candidate is likely going to win. That's why Africans have been very successful in terms of, not because they have extraordinary the candidates are good, but it's because you have the AU to win, and that's why we have. So the next thing is that, yes, Thomas, that's, AU has succeeded in, managing in putting its views across, and in some cases mainstream it. That's to be expected, and that's nice. But then so what? So there is one question: why should someone in Germany, why should someone in Europe care about it? Right? That's what I'm trying to. This is what I'm going to. The slides I'm going to use, and I want to say that you should care about it. In part because it is suggesting to you that when you are on the margins, it's not a death trap. That in other words, wherever you find yourself when you are in the margin, that's actually you can also operate from that particular margins. That if some point the international system is set up in such a way that Europe, and to some extent you can see at the moment, Europe has become on the margins in the Russia-Ukraine war. See the dialogue between the Americans and then the Russians. And then Europe wants to be at the table, to some extent dictated by Europe. So how can you operate from that particular markets and then still be in the driver's seat? So thinking about it in terms from a strategic point of view is always good to be able to know that you can operate from the margins and the things that you need to do if you want to operate from the margins, right? Part of what I wanted to say is that, European countries are known to, they have good strategy when it comes to operating from the center because they've always been there or thereabout. But do they have the strategy to be able to operate from the margins? And that is why I thought that I would be. So you should care. And maybe there's a lesson there that can be, if you're a policymaker or you're an academic thinking about doing this, the first thing you need to do is to be able, at least from the AU perspective, is to set this normative standard, some normative goal. And then as a boundary, normative boundaries. Once you set those normative boundaries, it gives you the chance to be able to operate effectively. The question then becomes, given the nature of, politics of great power hypocrisy, can you set the normative standard and keep those normative standards intact? That is one of the things. So you need to set those and hold those boundaries and set your red lines. And I think that's what the EU has been able to do. So set those lines. Maybe it can afford to do that because it has nothing to lose. And its red lines are not major red lines, so it can do that. So the question then is that going forward, can you set those normative standards and hold those boundaries, let people know your red lines? So if Russia is crossing those red lines, they know that these are the red lines that you don't have to cross. Can you set those normative standards and hold them to it? So that's the first thing. If we're also going to do it, and this is one of the things I've been telling the Canadians, and I think the Canadians are learning in a hard way. In the past, because we are closer to the Americans, and I will go with the Americans, we are often at the center or close to the center. So we didn't have to worry about operating from the margins. Now the US is going its own way. And Canada is left out in the loop. So it's learning how to do it. And it's now beginning to build strategic partnership. So you could see that we are spending a lot of political capital in Europe, which we don't used to do. I think our foreign minister was in Brussels, I think yesterday, and he's going to be there for some time. And they are building strategic relations, broad-based strategic relationship. In the past, places like Africa and others, we don't need Africans. We just go there to do aid. Now they recognize that no, you can't do that anymore. You have to be so broad-based strategic partnership. It's going to be very important. And it's not at the formal forum that is most important. It is building it at the informal level. The informal level is a great equalizer. You can have those formal forums, but also having these informal channels where you can communicate. It's great. I think for me, it's the most important. And I think it's part of the reason why you have been very effective in doing it. And the last thing that I would say is that we should care about it, because I am making the argument that Africa or African views have been shaping, making and remaking the post-1945 international world order. You remember that when the Africans joined the international system, except Ethiopia, Liberia, and maybe a part of South Africa, most African countries were under colonial rule, and they were not part of the negotiation that created the post-1945 world order. And therefore, it was easy for Africans to say, we're not part of it, and therefore the world. Africa can't say that anymore, at least from the 1945. Those formal structures, yes, I think you can say that. But in terms of reconstructing some of the ideas, Africa has contributed to it. So Africa is not just only a taker of global international norms, it's actually part and parcel of reconstructing those particular norms, and therefore we should care. So when you're a politician, African politicians somewhere say, we're always marginalized, where our views are not taken into account. Actually, when you actually look at the empirics, you do the research, that is not factually accurate in terms of that. Maybe Asians should be complaining even more, right? Asians, Latin Americans, and others, but in terms of the Africa, I think Africa has been very. So if the post-1945 international world order is not working, Africa has also been part of constructing what we have done in terms of the world. If it's working, Africa's view is there. If it's not working, Africa's view is not. So we are not, Africa is not, to some extent, outside of the international system. So the broad point I'm trying to make is that contrary to what everyone, a number of people have been talking about, especially African politicians have been peddling around, Africa has not been at the peripheral side of international system. If you have been able to get your ideas, norms, practices, beliefs to be at the center of global discussion, you cannot claim to be at the margins. And that's the kind of message that I wanted to send across. So thank you so much for listening to me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.